And now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, a special hello goes out to the Director of Media for the Boston Bruins alumni, Mr. Mark Boland. Nice to see you, Marky.
Welcome to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the home of behind-the-scenes interviews, stories, and memories that celebrate the heritage of the great game of hockey. The Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast is hosted by Mark Boland.
Episode 27 of the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast features Phil Myre, goaltender who played over 400 NHL games in 14 seasons with the Montreal Canadiens, Atlanta Flames, St. Louis Blues, Philadelphia Flyers, Colorado Rockies, and Buffalo Sabres. Phil was selected by the Canadiens in the first round, 5th overall in the 1966 draft. He played parts of 3 seasons with the Habs before being chosen by the Atlanta Flames in the 1972 expansion draft. Phil and Dan Bouchard were an outstanding 1-2 tandem in goal for the next 6 seasons. Individually, Phil's finest NHL season came in 1974-75 when he recorded 5 shutouts and a 2.85 goals against average for the Flames. Now, later in his career, Phil helped backstop the Philadelphia Flyers to an incredible 35-game unbeaten streak. After retiring as a player, Phil moved on to an impressive career as a goaltending coach with many teams, including the Red Wings, Kings, and Florida Panthers. Phil is now a sports consultant and inspirational speaker. You can visit his website at philmyretalkshockey.com. Now, let's talk classic hockey with Phil Myre. We're back on the show with Phil Myre, and what a career he has had, both as a player, a coach, a consultant, and as a keynote speaker. And it's a great thrill to have you here today, Phil. Thanks so much for putting the time aside for us.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark.
Phil, how does a young kid in Quebec decide at some point to become a goaltender?
You're going way back here now. It's the how I became a pro hockey player is a little bit unusual because I lived in a small town just west of Montreal up until I was 12 years old, and I never really played organized hockey in that town. There wasn't much in those days, but skated every day though. We had a nice rink across the street from my house that all the kids in the neighborhood used to take care of, and we were on the ice. Any free time we had, we were on the ice. And then when I moved to Montreal, I was 12 years old, and I moved to the suburbs of Montreal in LaSalle. And it's funny because it was at a bus stop. You know, people remember certain days in their life, and to me, this day, I remember it was a chilly September morning when I was 12 years old at a bus stop when this kid asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I had some plans to go do something, but he said, I'm going to my tryouts. And I said, tryouts for what? And he said, hockey. I said, you have to try out to play hockey? So anyways, my long story short, I went to the tryouts. Luckily, he asked me, he said, what position do you play? I said, I can play anywhere. But when I was back in the small town of Rigaud, there was the one kid that had a set of goalie equipment, and he didn't like to play goal anymore. So I used to always wear that equipment, and I was always the goalie on the street. And I used to throw a ball against the wall and pretend I was Terry Sauchuk or Jacques Plante in my house, too. I always loved goalies. So I told him, hey, I can play anywhere, but I can play goal, too. Oh, he says, good. He says, our goalies suck. So anyways, long story short, I went to the tryouts and, of course, made the team. And then the next year, we won a tournament, and a scout from the Boston Bruins asked me to go to Victoriaville training camp. And, at 14 years old, I went to a junior training camp in Victoriaville and borrowed the equipment. Of course, in those days, they supplied the goalie equipment. We played for the parish. So I went to the parish and borrowed the goalie's equipment and I went to a junior training camp with the parish goalie equipment with no goalie skates. And anyways, ended up making the team, playing 5 years of juniors, winning the Memorial Cup, and signing and getting drafted by Montreal. So,
well, that's a pretty incredible story. It kind of all starts at a bus stop somewhere.
I often wonder, where my life would have been, where I would be today if I hadn't been at that bus stop that day.
That is pretty incredible and pretty humbling too, because you never know.
Things were different in those days. Obviously now the kids have to play AAA hockey, and they become stars before they're drafted. They get drafted by the junior teams, and things were different. But it was fate, really, that brought me here.
Absolutely. Well, you end up with quite a junior hockey team in Niagara Falls, which that first year, a lot of future Bruins, including Derek Sanderson, on that team very well, and Hap Ems is your coach.
Yep.
I'm friends with Gary Swain, and he would tell me of Hap Ems stories, one of which was if he felt you guys weren't necessarily ready to play, he would have the bus park a couple of miles away from the rink you were playing in that night, and regardless of the weather, that you would walk in the cold to get you guys up and ready to play your game. Was that a true story?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we always walked. If we traveled to Peterborough or Oshawa or from Niagara Falls, he'd always stop the bus. I can't remember how far it was. When you're 18 years old, you don't really count the miles, but it might have been a half a mile or something. It seemed longer than it really was. But he used to let us walk, and it's probably in retrospect not a bad thing.
Right.
Hap was a good coach. He had a good way to make people play at their best, and he had a good way to pick people to play together, and the one thing he's always said, he won 2 Memorial Cups, and at least in Niagara Falls, and lost one, and each one of them was with a French Canadian goalie.
Right. Most of your team was basically kids from Ontario, and a few French Canadians mixed in, yourself included. But in year 2, you a lot of future Whalers, Gary Swain, Tom Webster, Rick Lee, Brad Selwood, yourself, a lot of talent on that team, and you end up going all the way, winning the Memorial Cup. And explain a little bit about that experience. It really was obviously it's a huge deal in Canada, but you're playing the teams from other parts of the country. And tell me about your memories of winning it all in Memorial Cup.
Well, things were different then, obviously. But if I go back to my days in the Quebec League, I played 5 years as junior and won 4 championships as a juniors. And I played in the Memorial Cup when I was in the Quebec League. And it's the first time, as a matter of fact, that in those days you'd play for the East. We'd play the East. There was the Provincial League, the Metropolitan League, and there was a league out Nova Scotia was kind of an independent team, and we had to win the East, and then the West had to win the West, and playing for the East, we then, after we won the Quebec, we had to play Ontario, and that's the first time I played against Bobby Orr. He was playing for the Oshawa Generals, and obviously, Oshawa won. But we gave him a good go, and I think that's the first time that Bobby Orr hurt his knee, because I think he didn't play. He had to go out and play the West after they beat us, and he didn't play the whole series, or he missed. He might have played one game in that series against Edmonton, I think it was. But anyway, so I kind of escalated to the summit, because in my last year of junior, we ended up winning the Memorial Cup. And what I remember the most of that year, or that series, of that experience, really was winning our own league, because there were two teams who were super powers, were the Montreal Junior Canadiens and the Kitchener Rangers, and we barely finished. I think we finished in fourth place, just enough not to have to play one of those teams in the first round.
Right.
And we ended up beating Montreal in the semifinals, and they had an outstanding team, with Hull and Tardif, and I think Gilbert Perreault was just an up-and-coming guy. They had Guy Lapointe, and, they were strong. And we beat them. And then we beat Kitchener, who had beaten us all year long. We didn't beat them one game in the whole season, and we ended up beating them in 8 games, because there were no overtimes then.
Oh, wow!
It was the first team with 8 points.
That's amazing. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and I think one of the games was a tie. And anyway, we beat them in 8 games, and like they were big, they were tough, they were talented, and it was the best memory of that whole experience was beating those two teams. And then when we played the West, we played Estevan from the West, and the whole series was in Niagara Falls, but. We played one game in Montreal, because Montreal that year broke attendance record, and they felt that if they brought the Memorial Cup to Montreal, maybe they would get 10 or 12,000 people, and it didn't really happen. Short notice, and the people didn't know the teams, but anyway, we went out there to play a game. But the biggest thing that happened too is that both teams were Boston Bruins affiliates.
Right.
Because then the NHL teams used to sponsor the junior teams. So Estevan and Niagara Falls belonged or were sponsored by the Boston Bruins. In the very first warm-up, very first game in the Niagara Falls Arena, both teams came out for warm-up wearing the same uniform. Same colors, different crest.
Right.
And they had to decide, who would wear the whites and who would wear there was a gold uniform.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the first game, they said, there isn't enough contrast between the two. So we had to wear the St. Catharines Blackhawks jerseys.
Wow.
The series. And when we played in Montreal, we ended up wearing the Montreal Canadiens jersey. And that actually was the first time I had been drafted by Montreal. It was the first time that I wore the Montreal Canadiens jersey in a game.
Interesting.
Yeah. And finally, in the final game, I remember that as the minutes were winding down in the final game, that we were winning by 5 goals in the third period, the guys used to go into the dressing room, when they weren't on the ice, to change their jerseys so that when we win the cup, we could wear our own jerseys.
Oh, that's funny.
So at one time, there might have been some guys on the ice with the St. Catharines Jersey Blackhawks, Niagara Falls Blackhawks on the same team.
Well, I've never heard that. That is a very interesting piece of hockey. But as you noted, you're number 1 draft pick by none other than the Montreal Canadiens. You spent your first year of minor pro in Houston, and I was curious, this is about 5 years before the World Hockey Association Arrows came to Houston, and I was curious about what hockey was like in Houston, Texas in the 1960s.
Oh my, I was a 19-year-old going to Texas, from small town Quebec. So it was all hockey, It was all focused on hockey and very little exploring the area. And it was a busy season. So I don't remember very much about Houston itself,
we
played it in the old Sam Houston Coliseum.
Right.
Which was an old arena. I guess it was adequate, but the viewing areas weren't very good. And the fans would come out. I don't really remember filling up the building, but there were fans there. It was, I don't know how popular it was. Like I said, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the outside of our own focus of the game. But it was different, certainly, and quite a learning experience. Guy Lapointe was my roommate. We got an apartment together, and I know we ate a lot of hamburgers.
The nutrition standards a little bit different in the 1960s, but what was it like?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for a young man like yourself going to training camp with the Montreal Canadiens, storied franchise, legendary players, playing against grown men now for the first time out of junior. What was your experience like going to Montreal Canadiens training camp there in the late 60s for the first time?
Well, I got to tell you, the first time I walked in the Montreal Canadiens dressing room, having grown up, as you say, I've been growing up in that area. John Beliveau was like, there was God, and then there was John Beliveau, and then depending on certain days, it might have been the reverse. But the first time I walked into the dressing room, I ran into John Beliveau, and it was like I had to pick up my jaw from the floor, and then say, Mr. Beliveau, and he was so kind and so inviting. He knew who I was, which I was surprised, and took me around the dressing room, introduced me to the trainers, and showed me around. And it was, you talk about leadership. That was leadership. But anyways, Montreal in those days had two farm teams. There was 110 players at training camp.
Nice.
So today, if you look at today, there's at least more than half of that. If a team has 50 players at training camp, that's probably a lot. We had 110 players at training camp. They had a team in the American League in Cleveland, and they had a team in Houston. And they would send their younger players to Houston and the veteran players in the American League. And so I went to Houston. Played with. Like I just said, Guy Lapointe was my roommate. Who else was there? Phil Roberto. No, wait a minute. No, Phil Roberto would have been the next year. No, Phil was there. It was Jude Drouin. We had a decent team.
Yeah, Boom Boom Caron.
Boom Boom Caron, yeah. He was one of our veteran guys, played with a stick about 3 feet long. It had a really, really short stick. But he was one of our veteran guys, and, it was quite an experience.
And your backup that year wasn't half bad, Tony Esposito.
Yeah, well, no, he wasn't quite a backup, but, we turned pro the same year, and I was 19 or 20, and I was turned 20. And he was like 25 because he came out of college, and
right.
He was a little bit older. And we roomed together for a while on the road, and it was an experience to play with him because he had a different style and a different preparation for the games, and I considered him more of a veteran than I because he was older than me. So I took a lot of pointers from him.
Phil, 1969-70, you make your debut with the Canadiens in the NHL. Do you remember your first game? Was it at home?
It was at home. I believe the first time I played in a game, I replaced Rogie in the third period. And I believe it was against the Oakland Seals. And, so I played one period. That was the first time that I actually played in a game. And then my first full game, I think, was against St. Louis. But it's kind of vague, I do remember my first shutout though. Was in the very first game in the Buffalo Auditorium.
Oh, wow.
With Buffalo. That was the following year.
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo came into the league, and the very first game that was played in the auditorium was against the Canadiens, and I played in that game and shut them out. I believe it was 3-0. And I like to say that I stood on my head and won the game by myself, but I had 14 shots. But there were 14 good shots, though, you know.
I wanted to take a step back real quickly. When you that 69-70 season, your second year pro, you also play for the Montreal Voyagers, and that team was, for a team in the American Hockey League, was incredibly talented. And I believe you won the Calder Cup that year, if I recall. Did you guys go all the way that year?
Well, yeah, I only played there up until December. There was quite a few of us that started on that team.
Mm-hmm.
I think Reza Hull and Tardif and Roberto and I don't know about Guy Lapointe, but Pierre Bouchard. We all played a few games with the Voyagers, but in my case, Rogie Vachon and Gump Worsley were the goalies of Montreal. And they had traded Tony Esposito, so I was kind of the third in line. And Gumper retired in December.
Oh.
You know, and he'd had enough. You know, he wasn't wearing a mask, and it was the days of the banana sticks. You know, there was no limit to the sticks, and the puck would play tricks on you, and it would drop and curve, and finally Gumper said he had enough. So it was kind of brought up much earlier than anticipated, because I was expected to play at least a couple of years in the minors and then make my way up and replaced Gump Worsley. But Gumper retired and then returned like 2 or 3 years later with Minnesota with a mask.
Right.
Yeah.
Briefly.
And so, yeah, it was a great team. In retrospect, if I had to have a choice, in retrospect, it probably would have been better for me to play the whole year there, because I ended up only playing 10 games with the Canadiens that year.
Right. Well, the next year, 70-71, you do get in the regular rotation. Of course, you came into the Montreal Canadiens organization at a time when, at various times of your stay there, you were with 4 future Hall of Famers, with Tony Espo, Rogie, Gumper, and then eventually Ken Dryden.
Yep.
However, 70-71, you get your time to shine. You played 30 games during the regular season. And towards the end of the season, of course, Ken Dryden comes on the scene. And we're talking a little bit, I want to talk to you a little bit about overcoming obstacles as a young professional. And here's an example of keeping a disciplined mindset on your part. 70-71, Dryden comes in, plays all the playoffs. The team wins the Stanley Cup. The following season 71-72, Kenny plays 90% of the games with you backing up. So you've gone from playing, in a regular rotation to much less. So my question for you as a goaltender and a young pro, how are you mentally preparing, knowing that you're not going to play a lot, the importance of practice and the importance of staying on top of your game when you're not playing regularly?
Well, I tell you, it was difficult. And one of the things in those days, there was one coach, and then they added an assistant coach later on. But there wasn't the guidance that the players have today. In other words, today, they've got the head coach, they got 3 assistant coaches, they have a psychologist, they have a mental strength coach, they have they have people that you can go to, and in a goalie's case, you have a goalie coach that you can go to help you deal with all of these things. When I played, in the era that I played, I played from the late 60s to the mid 80s, that didn't happen. You're on your own. If there was maybe a teammate on the team that you trusted, his judgment, then maybe you could confide in him. But it was very rare. So, you had to deal with these things by yourself. And a lot of times, you don't always deal with it, the way you should, and you learn from it, and then, you make mistakes, and you say, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that," or "I shouldn't have thought that way," and you need to start controlling what your thoughts are, to stay positive and stay positive, because it's very easy when you're not playing, and particularly in Montreal. The most exposure I had in the media was when I wasn't playing. When I was playing, there was hardly any exposure on me. But all of a sudden, when I'm not playing, they've got all of those questions and all of those highlights. So you got to deal with the media, and you got to deal with being ready, and deal with your teammates, and so you'll in those days you kind of learned along the way by yourself, by trial and error.
Right.
And it takes a tough skin sometimes, to all of a sudden you haven't played in a month, and you got to go in there,
right,
and perform, and it's tougher when you're young, you're 21 or 22 years old. You haven't really established yourself in the league yet. It's easier, shouldn't say easier, but it's easier to handle when you're older and you've been around. And like when I went in Buffalo late in my career and didn't play a whole lot, I was able to handle that much better than I did when I was 22. So yeah, it's not easy, and particularly in those days, you had to kind of deal with it, by yourself.
Absolutely. Well, you get a great break in your career. The NHL expands in 1972 to Atlanta and Long Island, and you are chosen to play hockey in the Deep South with the Atlanta Flames. And of course, now this is where I guess when you really have a chance to blossom. The Flames make a great decision as an expansion team that has to sell themselves down south. They start out by solidifying the goaltending situation right away and become a respectable team right away. What was it like, I guess, right off the bat? First of all, I'd like to ask you about Boom Boom, I should say Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion.
Yeah.
And what was it like playing for him? Obviously, you knew a lot about him, being a kid growing up in Quebec, in the Montreal area. But he was quite a character. And what was he like to play for?
Well, Boom Boom was probably the best coach for the situation that we had there. Cliff Fletcher was a manager, and he drafted a lot of character players, but limited in skills. So the guys knew how to play. They knew how to get ready. We competed hard every night. And with the Boomer's role, he wasn't a very technical coach. Matter of fact, there was very little, technique done. And at the beginning, there was no assistance. He was the only guy. But what he would do, what he was good at, was motivating people. And I mean, you got a picture of the Boomer. He looked like $1 million every day. Like every day. He had shoes shined, hair trimmed. Games, he had the three-piece suit, the diamond cufflinks. He looked like $1 million every day, and he believed in his players, and he really, instilled a lot of confidence in guys who were, the 19th and 20th player on the other teams, that before we were drafted by the expansion team. So I think for those 3 years, he was the perfect guy for the job. And obviously I was paired with Danny Bouchard for the 6 years that I was there, and we never finished worse than sixth in goals against. Right. In the 6 years that I was there, and with Danny and I.
I think the word I always looked at when I look back at that duo is consistency. I mean, every year you guys performed well for that franchise as pieces were moved around you and things were changing here and there. You could always count on Dan Bouchard and Phil Myre to provide solid goaltending.
Well, we had a tough time scoring, but like I said, we never finished worse than 6th in the league in goals against. So, and you talk about building character. I mean, we were friends, and I mean, we basically came from the same area, and where I moved when I was 12 years old. Danny came from LaSalle, and that's where I moved when I was 12. And you know, you talk about building character. I mean, we competed for ice time for 6 years. I don't think that the most that one of us played was 42 games in one season.
Yeah, it's very unique situation, wasn't it?
Yeah, and both of us played. We played sick. We played hurt. We didn't want to give the other guy really a chance to play multiple games in a row, because we knew that either one of us had the capability of doing that and succeed.
Well, that's a great lesson for you too, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a great lesson to you as well when you're talking to companies or kids about teamwork, where you're able to marry two different emotions at the same time. Your level of competitiveness, because you want to be getting your share of the ice time and playing time. At the same time, working cooperatively with Danny Bouchard and being friends and teammates at the same time. It's not easy for a lot of human beings to do. You're able to do it for 6 years.
Well, yeah, and it, it's kind of a friendly competition. You're on the same team, and you want to win, and you want to do what's best for the team, but at the same time, you want to be the guy,
Right.
And that's why you become a goalie, because kids become goalies because they want to be the guy. They become pitchers because they want to be the guy. They become quarterbacks because they want to be the guy. And goaltending is no different. And obviously, you want to play every game. So when you're not, then you're competing for ice time.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of teammates, and the first is Ken Houston, who you obviously has passed away earlier this year, and you went recently to a rink dedication for him in Ontario. Can you talk a little bit about that event, first of all, and then second of all, what Ken Houston was like as a teammate and a person?
Yeah, no, the event was great. They did a great job in presenting it. It's a really small community. I think there's about 3,000 people where Kenny is from. And they really did a good job, and I think the whole town was there almost. They dedicated the arena as the Ken Houston Agricultural Center or something, and it was a great event. They had the presentation at the arena, then they had a dinner dance, and they raised money for minor hockey in the area. I think there's a Ken Houston Foundation that helps out there. And it was an outstanding event. And unfortunately, my wife and I were out of the country for the memorial when he passed away, and we weren't able to go. And so we made a point to go to this event. And Ken was he had a lot of character. He came and he first played in the minors, and he was very patient. He came to training camp one year, and I sent him down to minors. And then he came to training camp again, and he sent him down to minors, and eventually he made it. And so he showed a lot of character in sticking with it.
Right.
And he was a quiet guy, but he was a tough guy. He had the big mitts, big hands, and he had a dry humor about him. Didn't say much, but once in a while he'd throw out the odd two-word joke kind of thing, And he liked to have a good time with the team, and he always stuck up for his teammate, and had a lot of respect for him. And him living in Dresden, Ontario, which is only a couple hours from where I live in Michigan, he used to come to some of the Red Wing alumni events, and so we spent some time together before he passed away too.
That's good. He didn't always have it easy. He wasn't a bad player at all. But back in that era, some teams would load up with goons or whatever, and the Flames did not. And so a player like him, like Ken Houston, had to handle a lot of that when things got a little bit out of hand, and he did so very, very well.
Yeah, well, eventually, Cliff Fletcher built a really big physical team eventually.
Right.
But it took time, The first 3 years, that was the area of the big bad Bruins and the Broad Street bullies and all that stuff, and there was a lot of intimidation going on, and it took Cliff, about 3 years to be able to build a team that could compete with these people. And we ended up getting a guy like Ken Houston and Kurt Bennett and Willie Plett.
Right.
And, we had some tough characters that eventually came on the scene and were able to compete with this this intimidation that was going on in the mid-'70s.
One other player that you played with for a long time, who passed away a few years ago now, I'd like to get your remembrance of Tom Lysiak.
Oh, Tom was the ultimate athlete. I mean, he was so good. He could have been a star in today's game. I think he would have been a star.
Mm-hmm.
He was very skilled. He was strong. He was tough. He could shoot. He could score. He could do it all. And he needed a little bit more consistency, which I think he could have had in today's game because of the better coaching. I'm not saying better coaching, but there's more coaching today. And a lot more guidance in today's game. And Tommy, I think, with the right guidance, would have been a superstar, even though he was a top player. Yeah, and I remember his first goal. As a matter of fact, he scored his first goal, and just to tell you how humble he was, he didn't really care about honors. He didn't pick up the puck, and one of the teammates picked up the puck, and so he kept it. And then one time we had a get-together, and I don't know how exactly it happened, but he gave the puck to my wife.
Oh.
He said, "I don't want this. You can have it." And my wife kept it all these years.
Wow.
And we kind of lost touch. We talked a few times, and I told him, "Hey, I have your puck." He says, "That's okay. Hang on to it." But we ended up going to an alumni event, and Tommy's wife was there, and we brought the puck and we gave it to her, and she was really happy.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's great.
Yeah.
Phil, your career in 77-78 with the Atlanta Flames concludes. You are traded to the St. Louis Blues, and I was curious, did that trade surprise you, and how were you informed of the transaction?
Well, you knew something was going on because, Danny and I had been together 6 years, and I guess Danny had been to the papers saying that he wanted to play more, and so you know something was going to happen. So no, it's just a phone call. You've been traded, and then you get the phone call from the general manager from the other team, and they tell you to talk to the travel person, and away you go. The next day, you're wearing a blue uniform.
There you go. It was interesting because that team, you played well. You go over there, you do a real good job for them, but they can't score. They have a couple young guys, Brian Sutter, Bernie Federico, who are just starting, so they're not anywhere near what they became. Team just could not score. You're holding it down in goal. The franchise is in a little bit of financial disarray. What was the experience like as a member of the St. Louis Blues?
Well, yeah, that was a different experience because I was playing all the games early on for the first year, and it was really the first time in my career that I was the guy. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, you mentioned the financial problems. That was right around the time that the Solomons sold the team, and there was no owner. We lost. There was the World Hockey Association at that time. We lost a lot of the draft picks to the World Hockey Association. We lost some of the players on the team to the World Hockey. So it was pretty depleted. and Ralston Purina kind of came in and bought the team. But and you mentioned Bernie Federico and Brian Sutter. We had 3 or 4 good young players, but they were young. They were our best players, but they were young. So it was funny because I remember one time I was the player of the week, and I had played 3 games, gave up 3 goals, and never won a game. So there was a 1-1 tie, and a 2-1 loss, and a 0-0 tie. I believe that was the case,
Right.
And so I was player of the week without winning a game.
Right. Well, you had to be near perfect in your career. Now, here's another good lesson that your career. You end up getting traded to the Philadelphia Flyers, which of course is an entirely different experience. The head coach there is Pat Quinn. Now, Pat, of course, played defense for the Atlanta Flames and knew you. I assume you had a very good rapport as your careers would kind of intertwine over the years. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, before we get into the actual 79-80 season, can you talk a little bit about Pat Quinn?
Well, Pat's probably the best coach I've ever played for. And I knew Pat probably better than anybody. We played together for 6 years in Atlanta. And then he traded for me in Philadelphia. I played for him for 2 years. And then when I retired from playing, I went to Los Angeles, and I was a coach with him for 4 years. Well, 3 years, actually, because he left after the 3rd year. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we did spend a lot of time together, and he made it pretty clear to me when I first went to Philadelphia that I was there to provide some experience for the young kids that they were bringing up, which included Pete Peters, Rick St. Croix, and what was the goalie who died in a car crash?
Pelle Lindbergh.
Pelle Lindbergh. And so, that was my role to be there. And Pete Peters had a much better year than anybody anticipated, and that's the year that we went on a 35-game unbeaten streak, which is still a record today.
Right.
But going back to Pat, I mean, Pat was to me was the best coach I've ever played for. He was ahead of his time as far as systems and rotations on the ice, and he brought in a lot of things. Pat was a thinker, and he initiated a lot of new things. He wasn't a coach that was very strict, hands-on guy. He trusts his players. He trusted his players to be ready to play, and of course we had good leadership in on that team with Bobby Clark and Bill Barber and a lot of guys that had leadership qualities, so Pat definitely was a guy that made you think, and he kind of lets you be yourself, kind of thing.
Right. Well, I think also it's a good lesson because you developed a mutual respect as players, and then of course he was a coach when you were a player, and then you coached together. So it's a great lesson about building relationships and how that could benefit a person in business or in sports or wherever down the line. And that relationship certainly paid a lot of dividends for both of you over time.
Well, you bring people you know and trust. He brought me into Philadelphia because he knew that I was a hard worker, and I was a guy who was ready to play every night, and I was a team man, and he knew what he was getting. And then he hired me as a goalie coach, assistant coach, for the same reasons. And, in many cases in the National Hockey League or in pro sports, there aren't very many jobs that are had based on a paper resume.
Right.
Most coaches will bring in assistants that they know, that they trust, that they, have a feeling for how they're going to react to certain situations, because it's a very demanding career, lot of ups and downs, and a lot of challenges along the way, and you need people who make good decisions and are prepared to face all of the adversity.
During that 79-80 season, as you noted, 35-game unbeaten streak, unprecedented, probably because of the rules of the game today, will never be touched. As you said, you had great leadership with Bobby Clarke and Bill Barber, of course, and a couple young kids. I just talked with Brian Propp, a rookie that year. Kenny Linsman.
Yep.
Kenny Linsman came on the scene. What was that? I guess
he was a rookie that year.
Absolutely. So what's the mentality now? This is a somewhat different situation for you because you played for good, solid teams up to that point. Of course, you played for a great team in Montreal. This is an intimidating team still at that point. You get Paul Holmgren, you get Ben Wilson, you got some real tough guys.
Yeah.
So my question is, what is it like? Can you feel when teams come into the spectrum at that point that you have an advantage before the game even starts from an intimidation level? Tough place to play.
Well, yeah, I mean, I went in there during the Broad Street Bully years in the early '70s, and certainly, the teams that I went in there with, there was a lot of intimidation. Mm-hmm. They called the Philly flu. A lot of times the guys got sick all of a sudden, and mm-hmm. they called it the Philly flu. But the one thing about the Flyers is that Ed Snyder built a great culture there, whereby a team stuck together right from the beginning. Even in the late '60s in the expansion, there was always a team that stuck together, and it was part of the reason was the culture that Ed Snyder built. And without getting into too much details, but he did put a lot of pressure on players to perform, but at the same time he treated players very well, and when you did perform. And we had good leadership in the team. I'll give you an example of leadership by Bobby Clarke. We were about, and I don't know the number of games, I would say we were about 6 or 7 games into the streak. Mm-hmm. And we played 2 home games. I think it was 2 Canadian teams. I think one was Vancouver, one was Edmonton. We won the games I forget the scores, but we had to score 5 and 6 goals to win. And we didn't play well and won the 2 games. And it put us on a 7-game unbeaten streak or something like that. And I don't know the numbers exactly. But the next day after that second game, Bobby Clarke called a players-only meeting. And he said, guys, we play like this, we're not going to make the playoffs. Mm-hmm. So everybody's kind of looking, hey, we're on a 7-game winning or unbeaten streak. And Bobby Clarke had that feeling and had that knowledge to say, hey, we didn't play well. Right. We didn't deserve to win. And if we continue on that path, we're going to lose. We're going to end up losing 3 or 4 games. And so that kind of woke up everybody. And we continued to win, and we started playing much better. And so that was an example of the leadership we had in that room. And another time when I think we were down 5-2 in Pittsburgh, and we ended up winning the game 7-5. Bobby Clarke had 5 points. Wow! And so he was a great leader and a great player. To me, he was the player I hated the most to play against, and the teammate I respected the most.
Right. I guess that would be the ultimate compliment. Yeah. Speaking of that, Phil, real quick, who was you played against everybody who's anybody in that generation, of course. Who was the best player you ever played against?
Bobby Orr.
No doubt about that.
No, Bobby no doubt about it. Yeah.
Didn't hesitate. Yeah. Didn't hesitate on that one at all.
No, he's the best. I mean, a lot of respect for Wayne Gretzky, a lot of respect for Guy Lafleur and all these guys. I mean, there's some awesome players, but to me, Bobby Orr had the most influence on the game, from a defenseman standpoint. He won the scoring championship. He could pass, he could skate, he could score. He could play physical. He could fight. He could do everything. And my favorite analogy between him and Gretzky, and I think Gretzky is an awesome player. If you bring a layman person who's never seen a game in his life, and you watch Bobby Orr and Wayne Gretzky play, at the end of the game, that person who's never seen a game will say that Bobby Orr was outstanding because he carried the puck from one end to the other, and he was back, and it's very visible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Gretzky was kind of subtle in his game. He was a great player, but he didn't carry the puck a whole lot. He was always give and go, and being at the right place at the right time, and so smart, and so have such great vision. But for me, from a total player, Bobby Orr was the best, and obviously Gretzky's close second.
Right. Well, as I said, you saw them all, and your career winds down with the stays in Colorado and Buffalo, as you noted. I was curious, when you played for the Rochester Americans, you played for young coach Mike Keenan. And what were your impressions of him back then, before a lot of us really knew a lot about him? What kind of coach was he like?
Well, there's a lot more to just that, because I was obviously at the end of my career, and I was also an assistant coach with Mike.
Right.
That story began because when I got near the end of my career, I started planning to be a coach. I went to coaching clinics, and I took the coaching certification, and I wanted to be involved in hockey. So, and when Scotty Bowman hired me as the third goalie, he wanted me to play in Rochester, but he knew, because I was been at a coaching clinic where Scotty was, he knew of my interest in coaching, so he said, "You can be an assistant coach with Mike." And Mike was great. He was great to me. We did win the Calder Cup, and he is a great coach. He got great practices. He knows the game. He's got some. His motivation philosophy might be different from many other coaches. Like sometimes he's really tough on players, but I'll tell you what, he wins everywhere he goes. He wins, and it's not because the players love him, because the players don't like him.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, he wins. And there were times when I would always go in the office before I'd go and get dressed for practice, and he would tell me in advance. A few times he'd say, "Well, I'm going to tell this guy off today. He's whatever I'm going to tell him. After I'm done," he says, "here's what I want you to tell him." And I think he didn't mind. He wanted a team to rally around something,
right?
And if they rallied against him, he didn't care. And a lot of times that's what happened with Mike. The team rallied together, kind of against him, but at the same time he kept coming, and at the end of the day, they win.
Right.
And I enjoyed Mike. He was really good to me, and it was a great experience to be with him.
You've learned a lot. You played and coached with a lot of great coaches, and I'm assuming in your life you were able to assimilate a lot of the good points from each. Your coaching career, your scouting career in the NHL was very, very long. The LA Kings, the Red Wings, some great stops. Florida, of course, the Blackhawks, and of course the Ottawa Senators stay. I don't know. That's a whole show in itself, so we won't get into all the coaching. But my question for you is, when you are now coaching young kids at your career, you've taken all you've learned, and now you're, especially with goalies. I mean, you had some situations where I think one year you were with Detroit. Tim Shovelday played 72 games. I think in Florida while you were there, Roberto Luongo played 75. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is somewhat vague. Is taking all you've learned, what was your approach now to dealing with young goaltenders?
Well, I'll tell you a story of my very first coaching job in L.A. I had two rookie goalies, Bob Janicek and Darren Elliott. Mm-hmm. And two rookie goalies who, didn't have the high-end expectations at this point. And, as I came in there, I wanted to, make all the corrections and make them be the best they could be. But what happened was, like, even on the ice, if they let in a goal or in practice, and say on the short side, I'd walk over and say, hey, you got to correct your angle here. You weren't at the right place. And then I'd show them video. I'd show them the goals. And after about a month into that, I said, these guys must think I'm a total jerk, because every time I talk to them is because they made a mistake.
Right.
And so I decided that at that time that I would make a total 180 on this one and say, let's establish what we're working on together, the things that we want to do better, make sure that we recognize our assets, what you do good, make sure we recognize the things that we want to do better, and then, have a plan. And then when things happened that they were doing the things that we that we were working on, that's when I would dart to the goalie and say, hey, how did you feel doing that? And the goalie say, yeah, that was great. Mm-hmm. And so that's the philosophy I adopted, that I wanted to dwell on the asset, really focus on the assets, and then build on in a positive way, so that rather than, when you're showing video, you got to show the goals, but as soon as I recognized that they knew what they did wrong, if they did anything wrong, we would move on, and I would show them something they did well in the game, and so to try to build that image and to have some key words that you throw at them, that players remember. So it reminded me of a story one time when I coached in Ottawa, Patrick Lalime. Like, I always, the one thing I used to always yell, I like to have keywords, and one of the keywords was good stick, good stick, and intercepting passes from behind the net with the stick.
Right.
And there was one playoff game that the play developed, and Patrick had his stick and intercepted the pass, and the pass went on to one of our players and went down the ice, and he scored. Mm-hmm. And right away after the game, rather than talk about the game, I walked into the dressing room, and Patrick's laughing. He says, "I thought about you." He said, "Good stick." I said, "Yeah." So that's good that you think about me in the game in a positive way.
Absolutely. That's extremely important. And now, among other things you're doing, you are speaking to various businesses and groups and sharing some of these lessons that carry from not just sports and hockey, but also life in general and business. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I enjoy doing it. I did it for a while in 2004 during the lockout. I started doing some of that stuff, and then I did it again. I think around 2010 or 11, I did a few again, and now I'm building up to it again. And I do some schools. I do some corporate stuff and teams. I have kind of a keynote one that I do. I call the NHL and Me. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a non-theme keynote thing, where I tell a lot of stories. Like and I combine it with the NHL, because I played in the late 60s on the day of the Great Expansion,
Right.
all the way to the 2000, and I mean played and coached all the way to 2012. So a lot has happened in the leagues during that time, and I kind of combine stories from when I played, when I coached, when I scouted, with the different growth of the National Hockey League. And then I do a couple other things, where it has to deal with leadership and motivation and peak performance and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to do it through some stories. It seems to attract some interest, and try to bring in some ideas on leadership and motivation and things like that. And I talk about coaches and what their philosophy is. I talk about Mike Keenan and
Mm-hmm.
Scotty Bowman, and as a matter of fact, one of the things I use is Daryl Sutter's favorite quote on leadership.
Mm-hmm.
He always says there's three things you can do. You got to lead. You're going to lead. You're going to follow, or get the hell out of the way.
Right. Well, Phil, we're glad you've taken the first part of that and bringing a positive force to the world, as you always had as a player and coach. I do have one suggestion for you, because you were at the forefront of the most dynamic time in hockey history, the biggest changes and everything. You ever think about writing a book?
I have, yeah. I'm writing a few blogs now. I think you mentioned one of the things you read. People can go at philmyretalkshockey.com and read some of my blogs. I'm starting doing that, and I'm writing some notes now. And who knows, maybe it'll come to fruition at some point. Where just got to make sure I get the right angle on it, because there's so many sports books. I want something that people are going to get something out of it.
Right.
Because otherwise it's not worth. So I got to find what it is that people are going to get out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then from that idea, I've got a lot of notes that I've taken, but I've got to put them all together and make it worthwhile. I just don't want to write a book to write a book.
Absolutely.
I'd like to have people benefit from it.
No doubt about it. Well, there's a lot of sports books, but there's only one Phil Myre, so maybe you can put that in your 2019 goals, and that'd be great. But anyway, I really want to say again, thank you so much for the time today. It was very interesting looking back at your career. Excited about what you're doing now. We'll keep on top of that and keep promoting that, and hopefully we can stay in touch. But again, thanks so much for the time today, Phil. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Phil. Take care.
All right, bye.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast. Be sure to visit us at prohockeyalumni.org.